step away from the computer.
Why are federal agents in my office?
You process these claims, correct?
I process thousands of claims.
For nearly a decade, Denise Harris oversaw Medicaid billing for a major healthcare network. Trusted with public healthcare funds and critical approvals, she held a position few questioned. But investigators would soon uncover a scheme that allegedly diverted millions and shattered that trust.
Not for patients who never existed.
What?
We followed the billing trail.
I want an attorney.
Black Medicaid coordinator Denise Brooks, you're under arrest.
For most of her career, Denise Harris was exactly the kind of employee healthcare administrators wanted overseeing critical government-funded programs. At 44 years old, Harris had spent nearly a decade working inside MetroCare Health Network, one of the largest healthcare providers in the region, operating from the organization's administrative offices in downtown Columbus. Ohio MetroCare managed dozens of clinics, specialty practices, and outpatient facilities serving thousands of Medicaid patients every year. By all outward appearances, Denise was a success story. She held a bachelor's degree in healthcare administration, earned several compliance certifications during her career, and had steadily climbed through the organization's billing department before becoming a Medicaid coordinator. Her annual salary had reached approximately $92,000, placing her among the more experienced administrative employees within the network. Coworkers described her as organized, professional, and reliable. Physicians knew her name. Department managers trusted her judgment. Auditors rarely questioned her work. When complicated reimbursement issues surfaced, Denise was often the person people called. That level of trust mattered because Medicaid billing is not a simple process. Behind every reimbursement claim is a chain of documentation. Providers submit records showing services rendered. Billing departments review coding and eligibility requirements. Claims are then transmitted through various systems before government funds are ultimately released. The process involves thousands of transactions, numerous approval layers, and strict compliance requirements. Errors happen constantly. Most are harmless. A mistyped code, a missing document, an incorrect service date. But because so much money moves through the system, even small mistakes can have significant consequences. That is why employees like Denise occupied such an important position. As a Medicaid coordinator, she sat at a critical junction between healthcare providers and government funding programs. She had access to billing records, reimbursement data, approval workflows, and reporting systems that most employees never touched. In many cases, she was responsible for reviewing exceptions and resolving discrepancies before claims moved forward. The system depended heavily on experience, and Denise had plenty of it. MetroCare processed hundreds of millions of dollars in healthcare reimbursements every year. Large portions of that funding came through Medicaid programs designed to provide healthcare coverage for low-income patients. Every week, thousands of claims moved through the organization's billing infrastructure. Most employees only saw a small piece of that process. Denise saw almost all of it. Inside the billing department, rows of aging desktop computers sat beneath fluorescent lights that hummed throughout the day. Printers continuously produced claim summaries and reimbursement reports. Employees worked through spreadsheets while phones rang from nearby cubicles. It was routine, predictable. And because it was routine, unusual activity could easily blend into the background. For years, nothing appeared out of place. Then a junior billing analyst named Kevin Morris noticed something strange. Kevin was 27 years old and had worked for MetroCare for less than 18 months. Compared to veteran employees, he occupied a relatively minor role. Most days involved reviewing claim batches and resolving small documentation issues. During a quarterly reconciliation project, however, several provider accounts caught his attention. At first, the discrepancies seemed insignificant. Certain reimbursement amounts appeared higher than expected. A handful of claims contained coding combinations that looked unusual. Some providers seemed to receive approvals faster than others. Nothing immediately suggested fraud. Healthcare billing systems generate anomalies all the time, Kevin assumed. He was looking at ordinary administrative errors. Still, the pattern lingered in the back of his mind. Over the following weeks, he continued noticing similar transactions appearing across multiple reports. The providers changed, the dates changed. But the reimbursement patterns felt oddly familiar. When, He mentioned the issue informally to a supervisor. The concern received little attention. The explanation was simple. Experienced coordinators had already reviewed those claims. If Denise Harris had approved them, there was probably a reasonable explanation. That assumption reflected a larger problem inside the organization. Trust had become a substitute for verification. Long-serving, employees rarely faced scrutiny because they had already earned institutional confidence. Managers focused on productivity. Auditors concentrated on broad compliance metrics. Executives relied on internal controls they believed were functioning properly. Nobody expected a respected coordinator to become the source of a problem. As months passed, the unusual transactions remained buried inside an ocean of legitimate billing activity. The complexity of the reimbursement system worked like camouflage. Questionable claims disappeared among thousands of routine approvals. Minor irregularities became statistical noise, and each unexplained transaction seemed too small to justify deeper investigation. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning in October 2024, a message arrived that changed everything. According to later investigative records, an anonymous tip was submitted through a state healthcare fraud reporting system. The message was brief, did not provide detailed evidence. It did not identify specific transactions, but it contained one allegation investigators could not ignore. The suspicious billing activity, the tip claimed, was not the result of clerical mistakes. Someone inside the organization allegedly knew exactly what was happening, and after reviewing the first batch of claims, investigators realized they were looking at something far more troubling than routine accounting errors. The anonymous tip did not contain enough information to prove anything. What it did provide was a starting point. Within days, investigators assigned to the state's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit opened a preliminary review. The request landed inside a government office building where rows of fluorescent lights reflected off gray filing cabinets and aging computer monitors. For the investigators, the allegation itself was not unusual. Anonymous complaints arrived regularly. Most led nowhere. This one was different because it appeared to align with concerns that had already surfaced inside Metro Care Health Network. The first step was documentation. Investigators requested several years of reimbursement records tied to a selection of providers identified in the initial review. They weren't looking for fraud yet. They were looking for inconsistencies. The team included veteran Medicaid fraud investigator Thomas Keller, forensic auditor Rebecca Owens, and financial analyst Michael Grant. Together, they began comparing reimbursement submissions against patient records, treatment documentation, provider certifications, and approval histories. At first, the numbers looked ordinary. Thousands of claims moved through MetroCare every month. Most were legitimate. Most contained the kinds of errors investigators expected to find in a healthcare system of that size. Then, Rebecca noticed something unusual. Several reimbursements appeared, significantly higher than similar claims submitted by comparable providers. The differences were not dramatic enough to trigger automatic alerts, but they appeared often enough to stand out. One claim became 3, 3 became 9, 9 became dozens. Individually, none of them appeared alarming. Together, they suggested a pattern. The investigators expanded their review. More records arrived in electronic batches. Spreadsheets filled with billing codes, patient identifiers, treatment dates, and payment amounts covered conference room tables. Computer monitors displayed claim histories stretching back years. As the review continued, another issue emerged: duplicate claims. Not exact duplicates. Those would have been easier to detect. Instead, investigators found reimbursement requests that appeared to reference the same patient encounters, while containing minor variations in coding or service descriptions. The changes were subtle. A date adjustment, a modified treatment code, an altered billing sequence. Enough to avoid immediate detection, not enough to avoid careful scrutiny. The team started building timelines. Patient appointments were compared against treatment logs. Treatment logs were compared against provider submissions. Provider submissions were compared against reimbursement approvals. The process was tedious. Hours passed beneath the steady hum of office ventilation systems. Investigators worked through lunch breaks. Coffee cups accumulated beside stacks of printed, Reports. What initially looked like isolated discrepancies kept resurfacing. Then came the service dates. Several claims appeared to reference treatments occurring on dates that raised questions. In some cases, documentation showed services approved before supporting records were finalized. In others, reimbursement requests appeared linked to treatment timelines that did not fully align with provider documentation. Again, none of these findings proved fraud, but they created friction. And investigators pay attention to friction. The deeper they looked, the more often the same provider identifiers appeared. Different patients, different clinics, different reimbursement amounts, yet certain provider numbers seemed unusually active. Those identifiers repeatedly surfaced within transactions already attracting attention. That discovery shifted the investigation. Instead of examining individual claims, investigators began examining relationships. Who submitted the claims? Who approved them? Who benefited? Or who had authority to move them forward? Approval records soon provided another important clue. Electronic workflow logs revealed that many of the questionable claims passed through the same administrative channels before reimbursement occurred. That did not automatically implicate anyone. Large healthcare organizations often rely on centralized approval structures. Still, the concentration was difficult to ignore. A growing percentage of questionable transactions appeared connected to departments operating under Denise Harris's area of responsibility. Investigators remained cautious. Patterns can be misleading. Data can create false narratives. They needed context. That meant interviews. Over several weeks, investigators quietly contacted current and former employees. Most conversations took place away from MetroCare facilities. Conference rooms, government offices, and rented interview spaces became gathering points for individuals who had never expected to speak with fraud investigators. Many employees reported nothing unusual. Others remembered details that seemed insignificant at the time. A billing specialist recalled being asked to expedite certain reimbursement requests ahead of standard processing schedules. A compliance employee described situations where routine verification procedures appeared to be bypassed. Another employee remembered questioning documentation on a claim only to be told that additional review was unnecessary. None of the witnesses described overt misconduct. What they described was pressure, subtle pressure, the kind that often blends into workplace routines. One interview proved especially important. A former supervisor recalled concerns raised during an internal reconciliation process nearly 2 years earlier. According to interview notes, the concern was reviewed briefly before being dismissed as a software issue. No extensive follow-up occurred. No formal escalation was documented. Investigators obtained archived emails related to that review. The messages revealed confusion. Questions had been asked, answers had been accepted. The issue had quietly disappeared. That detail highlighted a growing institutional problem. MetroCare's systems relied heavily on trust. Experienced employees received broad discretion. Exceptions became normalized. Procedural shortcuts became routine. Over time, certain transactions appeared to receive less scrutiny simply because the people involved were considered reliable. The controls existed, but they were not always enforced. As investigators continued, building transaction histories, the financial exposure became harder to ignore. Questionable reimbursements now totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. The number increased almost every week. Nobody could yet determine whether the figure represented mistakes, negligence, or something far more deliberate. But the anomalies were no longer isolated. They formed a recognizable pattern, and then a forensic accountant reviewing a reimbursement trail made a discovery that transformed what had begun as a routine audit into a major criminal investigation. The discovery came from a spreadsheet that, at first glance, looked no different from the hundreds investigators had already reviewed. For weeks, the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit had been buried in records. Conference room tables inside the State Attorney General's office were covered with claim summaries, provider registrations, reimbursement reports, and audit worksheets. The fluorescent lights stayed on long after sunset. Investigators rotated through stacks of paperwork while computer monitors displayed years of transaction histories. Most fraud investigations begin with a suspicious transaction. This one was beginning to reveal an entire network. The forensic accountant who identified the breakthrough was reviewing reimbursement payments, connected to several providers, already appearing in the investigation. The providers operated under different names, maintained separate business addresses, and appeared unrelated on paper. Yet something kept drawing attention. The money never seemed to stay where it landed. Payments would arrive through legitimate reimbursement channels, only to move again within days, sometimes within hours. The transfers followed no obvious pattern initially, but after investigators mapped enough transactions, connections started emerging. A medical consulting company in Columbus, a healthcare services vendor in Dayton, an administrative support contractor outside Cincinnati. Individually, each company appeared legitimate. Collectively, they shared details that were difficult to explain. Several used the same registered agents. Others listed mailing addresses connected to the same office buildings. A few appeared to operate from locations that investigators later found were little more than rented mailbox facilities. The deeper analysts dug, the more interconnected the businesses became. Subpoenas were issued for banking records. Those records opened an entirely new phase of the investigation. Financial analysts began comparing wire transfers, payment authorizations, provider registrations, tax filings, and business formation documents. Every new record added another line to a growing financial map that soon covered an entire wall inside the investigative workspace. Red strings were unnecessary. The spreadsheets told the story themselves. Money flowed from approved reimbursements into provider accounts. From there, portions moved through consulting agreements. Those consulting agreements led to vendors. The vendors transferred funds to additional entities. Several accounts repeatedly appeared at different points within the transaction chains. The same names, the same financial institutions, the same routing patterns. What initially looked like independent businesses increasingly resembled a coordinated network. Investigators remained careful with their conclusions. Complex financial structures are not automatically criminal. Healthcare organizations frequently work with consultants, billing contractors, and administrative service providers. But legitimate business relationships generally leave clear documentation. Many of these transactions did not. Several consulting agreements contained vague descriptions. Others lacked supporting work records altogether. In some cases, investigators found invoices requesting substantial payments for services that could not be independently verified. Questions were multiplying faster than answers. By early spring, investigators estimated that hundreds of thousands of dollars had moved through the questionable transactions already identified. Then the number grew, again and again. Each new account review expanded the potential exposure. Soon the investigation was no longer focused on isolated reimbursement anomalies. It had become a large-scale financial reconstruction effort spanning multiple years. Search warrants followed. Investigators sought access to internal MetroCare records, electronic communications, approval histories, and system activity logs. Digital forensic teams arrived carrying evidence collection equipment and portable storage devices. Inside administrative offices, employees watched as technicians quietly copied data from servers and archived systems. The atmosphere changed immediately. People who previously viewed the inquiry as a routine audit now understood something far more serious was underway. Executives requested updates. Compliance officers scheduled emergency meetings. Outside legal counsel became involved. Meanwhile, investigators continued building their timeline. Emails recovered through legal process revealed discussions surrounding reimbursement approvals, expedited claim reviews, and exceptions to standard procedures. Many messages appeared routine. Others attracted attention because they documented unusual urgency. Several employees questioned processing decisions. Responses often arrived quickly. Approvals moved forward anyway. Investigators also reviewed approval logs generated by MetroCare's billing software. These records provided timestamps, user credentials, workflow changes, and authorization histories stretching back several years. Unlike witness recollections, digital records rarely forget. Every login leaves a footprint, Every approval creates a timestamp. Every system modification becomes part of an audit trail. When investigators overlaid questionable reimbursements against system activity records, another pattern emerged. Again and again, credentials assigned to Denise Harris appeared at critical stages of the workflow. That finding did not automatically prove wrongdoing. Healthcare coordinators routinely handle large numbers of claims. Their credentials naturally appear throughout billing systems, but investigators were not examining ordinary claims anymore. They were examining transactions already linked to suspicious financial activity. The overlap became difficult to ignore. In transaction after transaction, Denise's user profile appeared connected to reviews, exceptions, approvals, or workflow, adjustments occurring shortly before reimbursement funds entered the broader network of accounts. The pattern repeated often enough that forensic analysts began tracking it separately. At the same time, investigators reviewed login histories. Those records revealed system access during unusual hours, including weekends and evenings when many administrative employees were not working. Again, there could have been innocent explanations: deadlines, backlogs, emergency processing requirements. But investigators were now evaluating those records alongside financial evidence, witness interviews, and reimbursement anomalies. Viewed together, the pieces were beginning to align. Inside MetroCare's executive offices, concern was turning into alarm. Board members received confidential briefings. Risk management teams calculated potential liabilities. Compliance officials attempted to determine whether internal controls had failed or been circumvented. No one seemed certain where the investigation would ultimately lead. What worried executives most was the scale. Each week, investigators identified additional transactions. Each month added new financial pathways. Each subpoena generated fresh records, requiring review. The estimated losses climbed steadily. $500,000, $1 million, $2 million. Then far beyond that, by the time investigators completed several major account reconciliations, the numbers were becoming almost impossible to comprehend. The suspected financial exposure was approaching $7 million. What had started as unusual reimbursement patterns identified by a junior billing analyst now threatened to become one of the largest fraud investigations in MetroCare's history. Yet experienced, investigators understood a critical reality. Suspicion is not evidence. Patterns are not. Convictions, financial maps, spreadsheets, and transaction chains might explain where money moved. But prosecutors would eventually need something stronger. Something that could withstand defense attorneys, cross-examination and courtroom scrutiny. And that meant proving not only that the money moved, they needed to prove who moved it. But investigators still needed proof that would survive scrutiny inside a courtroom. By the time investigators finished tracing the money, the case had entered a very different phase. The question was no longer whether suspicious transactions existed. The question was whether investigators could prove who was responsible for them. Financial records had revealed movement. Audit trails had revealed patterns. But prosecutors knew that a defense attorney could challenge patterns. They could challenge assumptions. They could challenge interpretations. What they needed now was a timeline built from records that could not easily be explained away. Investigators returned to MetroCare with a narrower focus. Instead of following money, they began following activity. Every login, every badge swipe, every remote connection, every approval, every modification. Inside a secure evidence room at the Attorney General's office, digital forensic specialists worked through archived system data collected under warrant. Computer monitors displayed login histories stretching back years. Security reports covered long conference tables. Investigators spent days comparing timestamps from different systems. At first, the records appeared routine. Most employees occasionally worked late. Healthcare administration rarely operated on a strict 9-to-5 schedule. But certain patterns stood out. Denise Harris's credentials appeared repeatedly during periods when unusual reimbursement activity was later identified. Sometimes the activity occurred during normal business hours. Sometimes it didn't. Several late-night login sessions drew attention. In one instance, System records showed access to reimbursement workflows after 10:30 p.m. on a Saturday. Another showed administrative activity shortly after midnight on a holiday, weekend. None of that was automatically suspicious, but investigators were no longer evaluating isolated events. They were evaluating them alongside years of financial evidence. The overlap continued to grow. Investigators then expanded their review to include physical access records. Every employee entering MetroCare's administrative offices used electronic security badges. The system recorded arrivals, departures, restricted area access, and after-hours entries. When analysts compared badge records against computer activity logs, another pattern emerged. Several late-night system sessions corresponded with building access records. Someone had physically entered the facility. Someone had accessed administrative systems, and the timing often aligned with transactions already under scrutiny. The investigation continued building from pattern to record. The next step was surveillance. MetroCare maintained security cameras throughout its administrative complex. Hallways, entrances, parking areas, and key office corridors were routinely monitored. Most footage had long since been overwritten, but investigators had managed to preserve certain recordings associated with dates identified during the financial review. The footage was not dramatic. There were no obvious crimes captured on camera, no bags of cash, no confrontations, no confessions. What the footage provided was context. Investigators observed employees entering buildings during unusual hours. They compared timestamps from camera footage against badge records and system activity logs. In several instances, the records appeared to align. An employee enters, a workstation becomes active, administrative actions occur. Claims move through approval. Channels. Funds are later released. The sequence, repeated enough times to become significant. Then came the interviews. Current and former employees were brought in gradually. Most appeared nervous. Few understood the full scope of the investigation. Some had only minor observations. Others provided information investigators had never heard before. One billing specialist described repeated requests to expedite certain provider reimbursements. A compliance employee recalled exceptions being approved without documentation that would normally be required. Another former worker remembered account information changing unexpectedly before claims moved forward. Nobody described obvious criminal behavior. What they described was a workplace environment where unusual requests gradually became normal. That distinction mattered. Large fraud cases rarely operate through dramatic violations. More often, they survive through small exceptions, repeated over long periods of time. Then investigators interviewed a former administrative supervisor whose account changed the direction of the case. The supervisor had left MetroCare more than a year earlier. During questioning, she described recurring interactions involving several providers who had already appeared throughout the financial investigation. The names were familiar. The dates were familiar. The circumstances were familiar. According to interview notes, she remembered questioning why certain providers consistently received expedited treatment. Her concerns never resulted in formal action. At the time, she accepted explanations offered by management. Looking back, she wasn't so sure. More importantly, she identified internal communications investigators had not previously reviewed. Search warrants quickly followed. Additional emails, archived messages, and system records were recovered. Those records became one of the most important developments in the investigation. Messages referenced exceptions. Messages referenced urgency. Messages referenced provider accounts already connected to suspicious reimbursement activity. Individually, none of the communications proved fraud. Collectively, they helped connect pieces investigators had struggled to explain. The timeline was finally taking shape. Month by month, analysts reconstructed how the alleged scheme operated. Questionable provider submissions appeared. Approval pathways changed. Administrative overrides occurred. Reimbursements were processed. Funds moved through linked accounts. The sequence repeated again and again as investigators mapped activity across multiple years. Innocent explanations became increasingly difficult to sustain. Errors happen. System mistakes happen. Administrative oversights happen. But long-term patterns supported by financial records, digital evidence, surveillance timelines, and witness observations are much harder to dismiss. Inside MetroCare, concern was becoming panic. Executives received increasingly detailed briefings from attorneys and compliance officers. Emergency meetings stretched late into the evening. Risk assessments circulated among board members. The potential exposure now extended beyond financial losses. Questions were emerging about oversight failures. Questions about internal controls, questions about how warning signs remained unnoticed for so long. Meanwhile, investigators were moving toward a decision. The evidence had grown beyond audits, beyond interviews, beyond suspicion. Agents began drafting operational plans. Arrest warrants were discussed, search teams were identified, interview strategies were prepared. For months, investigators had worked quietly behind the scenes, assembling thousands of records into a single narrative. Now they believed they were ready to act, and after months of quietly gathering evidence, authorities were finally ready to confront Denise Harris. The confrontation happened on a Thursday morning. Shortly after 8 a.m., employees were arriving at MetroCare's administrative headquarters as they did every other workday. The lobby coffee station was busy. Elevators moved between floors carrying managers, analysts, and support staff beginning another routine shift. Most had no idea that months of investigation had quietly led to this moment. Agents from the Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit entered the building. Carrying arrest warrants and search documentation, they moved calmly through security procedures before making their way toward the administrative offices, where Denise Harris worked. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as strangely normal right up until it wasn't. One moment, employees were reviewing emails beneath fluorescent office lights. The next, investigators were standing in the hallway asking for Denise by name. According to reports, Denise appeared surprised but composed. She was escorted into a private conference room away from co-workers. The conversation remained professional. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontation, just procedural language. An investigator informed her that she was being placed under arrest pursuant to a warrant issued following a lengthy fraud investigation. For several seconds, witnesses recalled seeing little reaction. Then the reality appeared to settle in. Years of professional credibility had collapsed into a single conversation.
As agents escorted Denise from the building, employees watched through office windows and partially opened doors. Some appeared stunned. Others looked confused. Rumors spread almost immediately. By lunchtime, conversations were taking place throughout the organization. By evening, local news stations were reporting the arrest. The allegations were extensive. Prosecutors charged Denise with healthcare fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, false claims violations, and multiple related financial offenses tied to the alleged misuse of public healthcare funds. Court filings described an investigation spanning years. The accusations quickly attracted public attention because Medicaid funding affects some of the most vulnerable patients within the healthcare system. Questions emerged immediately. How much money had actually been lost? Who else knew? Could the scheme have occurred without help from others? And perhaps most concerning, how had it remained undetected for so long? The first court appearance took place the following day, inside a federal courthouse crowded with reporters, attorneys, investigators, and curious members of the public. The courtroom itself felt subdued. Wooden benches creaked as people settled into place. Attorneys organized documents at counsel tables. Court staff moved quietly through routine procedures. Denise appeared noticeably different from the confident administrator many co-workers remembered. The confidence that once accompanied her professional reputation had been replaced by uncertainty. She spoke little during the hearing. Most of the discussion focused on procedural matters, release conditions, and scheduling. Prosecutors argued that the scope of the alleged fraud justified strict supervision while the case proceeded. Defense attorneys pushed back. They emphasized that Denise had no violent criminal history, had long-standing ties to the community, and had cooperated during portions of the investigation. The judge ultimately allowed pretrial release under specified conditions, but the legal battle was only beginning. Over the following months, Prosecutors assembled a case built on records rather than dramatic witness testimony. The evidence included years of financial documentation, bank records, wire transfer histories, provider registrations, tax filings, electronic reimbursement data, audit reports, approval logs, communication records. Investigators argued that together, these records revealed a coordinated scheme designed to move public healthcare funds through interconnected accounts and entities. The prosecution's presentation focused heavily on patterns. Jurors were shown reimbursement timelines, transaction summaries, digital workflow records. Investigators explained how questionable claims repeatedly appeared within the same approval channels, and how financial transfers allegedly followed consistent routes after reimbursements were issued. Witnesses from MetroCare described unusual requests, expedited processing, and exceptions to normal procedures. Compliance personnel testified about concerns that, in hindsight, appeared significant. Former employees described moments they had dismissed at the time but later recognized as possible warning signs. The defense attacked those conclusions aggressively. Their central argument was straightforward. A complex healthcare organization generates mistakes. Billing systems produce anomalies. Administrative employees process enormous volumes of information every day. Defense attorneys argued that prosecutors were confusing administrative failures with criminal intent. They pointed to organizational weaknesses. They questioned internal oversight. They challenged assumptions embedded within the investigation. Several witnesses acknowledged that MetroCare's compliance systems were imperfect. Audits were not always comprehensive. Certain procedures depended heavily on trust. Documentation reviews occasionally varied between departments. The defense argued that these institutional weaknesses created opportunities for innocent errors to be misinterpreted as evidence of fraud. At times, the courtroom became a battle between competing explanations. One side described deliberate misconduct. The other described systemic dysfunction. Jurors were left to determine which interpretation better matched the evidence. Outside the courthouse, the damage continued growing. MetroCare faced increasing scrutiny from regulators, insurers, and government agencies. Patients questioned whether public funds had been protected appropriately. Community trust suffered. Healthcare executives found themselves answering difficult questions during public meetings and media interviews. Even employees with no connection to the allegations experienced consequences. Co-workers who once viewed Denise as a respected professional struggled to reconcile the person they knew with the accusations being presented in court. Some believed the prosecution's narrative. Others remained skeptical. Many simply felt betrayed. As testimony continued, prosecutors refined their central message. This was not a story about accounting mistakes. It was not a story about paperwork errors. According to the government's case, it was a story about the calculated abuse of authority within a system built on public trust. The evidence, prosecutors argued, showed planning. It showed repetition. It showed awareness. Most importantly, they argued, it showed intent. By the time closing arguments arrived, months of testimony had been condensed into a single question. Were the irregularities the product of incompetence and institutional failure, or were they part of a deliberate scheme to exploit public healthcare funding? The answer would determine Denise Harris's future, but the verdict would also expose something larger. Problems that extended far beyond a single employee and deep into the systems responsible for safeguarding Medicaid funds. The verdict arrived after months of testimony, thousands of pages of records, and years of investigative work. Inside the federal courthouse, the atmosphere felt noticeably different from earlier hearings. Reporters filled several rows. Former co-workers sat quietly near the back of the room. Attorneys reviewed notes one final time, while court personnel moved through familiar procedures. The tension was no longer about evidence. It was about conclusion. For months, jurors had listened to competing explanations for the same set of facts. Prosecutors described a deliberate scheme involving reimbursement manipulation, financial transfers, and misuse of authority. Defense attorneys argued that investigators had mistaken organizational failures for criminal intent. Now the decision belonged to the jury. When the verdict was read, the room remained almost completely silent. Denise Harris showed little outward reaction. Observers later described her expression as controlled but distant. She remained seated as court officials continued reading through the findings. Years earlier, she had been viewed as a trusted administrator, responsible for helping manage the flow of public healthcare funds. Now that career had effectively ended inside a federal courtroom. The proceedings then shifted toward sentencing. Unlike the trial itself, sentencing focused less on whether misconduct occurred and more on consequences. Federal probation officers prepared detailed reports examining financial losses, professional history, and sentencing guidelines. Attorneys submitted written arguments. Government agencies calculated restitution figures tied to improperly obtained reimbursements and related financial activity. The numbers remained staggering. Investigators had spent years reconstructing transaction histories, tracing accounts, and identifying reimbursement flows connected to the alleged scheme. By sentencing, prosecutors argued that millions of dollars intended for public health care programs had been diverted through improper claims and related transactions. Defense attorneys sought leniency. They emphasized Denise's lack of violent criminal history, prior professional accomplishments, family circumstances, and years of employment before the investigation began. They argued that organizational weaknesses contributed significantly to the misconduct alleged throughout the case. They pointed to inadequate oversight, insufficient audits, poor internal controls, a compliance structure that often relied more heavily on trust than verification. Prosecutors did not entirely disagree. In fact, they acknowledged many of those failures, but they argued that institutional weaknesses did not excuse deliberate misconduct. According to the government, weak controls created opportunity. The choices themselves remained personal. Victim impact considerations became another major focus. Unlike traditional theft cases, there was no single individual standing in court describing direct losses. Instead, prosecutors framed taxpayers and public health care programs as the victims. Every dollar improperly diverted represented money unavailable for legitimate medical services. Investigators argued that fraudulent activity inside healthcare systems creates consequences far beyond financial spreadsheets. It affects trust, it affects confidence, and it affects public willingness to support programs designed to help vulnerable communities. When the judge finally issued the sentence, the courtroom remained quiet. The ruling included a substantial term of incarceration, financial penalties, restitution obligations, and additional restrictions associated with the convictions. For Denise Harris, the legal proceedings were effectively over, but the broader story was only beginning. In the months following sentencing, independent reviews examined how the alleged scheme survived for so long without detection. The findings revealed problems extending far beyond a single employee. Internal audits had often focused on overall compliance metrics rather than transaction-level anomalies. Warning signs appeared in different departments but were rarely combined into a unified picture. Information existed, coordination did not. Several reports identified excessive reliance on experienced personnel. Employees with strong reputations frequently received greater autonomy and reduced scrutiny. Over time, familiarity became a substitute for verification. That pattern appeared repeatedly throughout post-investigation reviews. The organization trusted people. The organization trusted systems. The organization trusted procedures. What it failed to do consistently was challenge those assumptions. Delayed compliance reviews created additional vulnerabilities. Some concerns remained unresolved for months. Others were documented but never fully investigated. Questions surfaced. Explanations were accepted. The process moved on. Fragmented reporting systems created another obstacle. Different departments maintained different records. Financial monitoring, compliance oversight, provider management, and reimbursement approvals often operated within separate channels. Critical information existed in multiple places. Nobody was seeing all of it at once. The investigation ultimately demonstrated how small failures can accumulate, not overnight, over years. In response, significant reforms followed. MetroCare implemented stronger approval controls designed to reduce reliance on individual discretion. Automated fraud detection software was added to identify unusual reimbursement activity before payments were processed. Independent audit procedures expanded. Outside reviewers gained broader authority to examine high-risk transactions and approval patterns. Enhanced monitoring systems tracked unusual system access, after-hours activity, and workflow exceptions more aggressively than before. Approval procedures were revised. Documentation requirements increased. Escalation protocols became mandatory for certain categories of transactions. Healthcare administrators described the reforms as necessary, even if they arrived later than they should have. Investigators reached similar conclusions. Several officials involved in the case later noted that the warning signs were not hidden. The information existed. The challenge was recognizing its significance before the losses became substantial. Accountability experts pointed to a recurring lesson found in many corruption investigations. Large scandals rarely begin with large violations. They begin with small exceptions, small shortcuts, small assumptions. Each one appears manageable on its own. Only in hindsight do they form a recognizable pattern. For MetroCare, the consequences extended beyond financial losses. Reputational damage lingered long after court proceedings ended. Employees worked to rebuild confidence among patients, providers, regulators, and government agencies. Trust, once lost, proved much harder to restore than compliance systems, and that ultimately became the lasting lesson of the entire case. A position built on responsibility became the center of a multi-million-dollar fraud investigation. A system designed to protect public resources failed to recognize warning signs that appeared again and again. The records existed. The concerns existed. The opportunities to intervene existed. Because in cases like this, the biggest question isn't how the fraud happened. It's why nobody stopped it sooner.